Welcome to DLM Tutoring and Development. Today, we're covering skill on IXL.com, A.6, square roots. So let's go ahead and get into this for today. In order to be able to find the square root of a number, first we need to know what a square root is. A square root is simply the number that when it's multiplied by itself, gets the original number. So the square root of a number is the value that when it's multiplied by itself, you get the original number. So in this case, we want to know the positive square root of 25. So I need to find a number that I can multiply by itself that's going to give me 25. Knowing that I have my multiplication facts memorized, I can simply create a factor tree, and I know that 5 times 5 would give me 25. So the positive square root of 25 is 5. Let's look at another example. What are the positive and negative square roots of 9/100ths? Well, first, before we even answer this problem, we need to remember something important about multiplying integers. When we multiply positive numbers by positive numbers, we end up with a positive result. But if we multiply a negative times a negative, we still end up with a positive result, which means that if I'm talking about the square root of a number, or a number that when multiplied by itself gives me another number, well, that number could be positive or negative, because even if it was negative, I would still get a positive answer, because a negative times a negative is a positive. Now, I know that can seem a little bit confusing, but let's take a look at how this works. In this particular case, we also have to remember a rule about multiplying decimals. In multiplying decimals, if you multiply decimals, you must have the same number of places behind your decimal point as you do in each of the factors that you're multiplying. So for instance, if I'm creating a factor tree, for 9/100ths, well, I already know that 9 is produced by 3 times 3. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the information that I know. I also know that I need to have 2 places after the decimal, because there are 2 places after the decimal. So in this case, in order for there to be 2 places after the decimal, I need to put my decimal point right here, directly in front of the 3. So now, if I were to multiply 3/10 times 3/10, I would need 2 places after the decimal, because there is a 3 behind the decimal here and a 3 behind the decimal here. So since this is correct, I have the right number of decimals behind my decimal, or the right number of places behind my decimal point. Now I know that my answer is correct. 3/10 times 3/10 will give me 9/100ths. So I know that this is going to be the same whether it is positive 3/10 or whether it is negative 3/10. Let's go ahead and try another one. If we were looking at this number is going to work out just the same. So I'm going to create my square, or my factor tree. I see that there are 4 places after the decimal. So I know that each of my decimal points, each of the factors that I'm multiplying need to have at least 2 places. They need to have 2 places behind the decimal point. So I know that they need to have 2 places each, because when they multiply together, they end up with 4 places behind the decimal point. So in this case, I'm now going to think of the number that when multiplied by itself would give me 16. Well, that number is 4. Again, I know this because of my multiplication facts. And if I didn't know it, I could just use a calculator. And then I'm going to make sure I fill in that gap. So I'm going to put a 0 into that gap, because it won't change the value of my number. So in this case, I end up with 4/100ths, positive 4/100ths, and negative 4/100ths, If I multiply them by themselves, they would be the square root of 16 10,000ths. Let's try another. So then, when we look at this example, we see that there's a fraction under our radical. Again, we're going to call this thing right here a radical, R-A-D-I-C-A-L, radical. Underneath this radical, we see there is 144 1600ths. Well, in order to do this, I actually am going to remember a very important property of quotients when it comes to square roots, which says that if I take the square root of a fraction, that is the same as taking the square root of each one of the numerator and denominator by himself and keeping it in that fraction. I'm going to get the same result. And so here, all I need to do in order to solve this is to simply think back to my multiplication chart. 12 times 12 is going to give me 144. So I know that the square root of 144 is 12. And then, as I said again before, 16 is made up by 4 times 4. So I know 4, sorry about that. I know 4 is going to be that first number. But then I have 2 zeros here. And I know that with the power of 10, if I have 2 zeros here, then in my factors, they each share 1 zero. So my answer is the square root of 144 1600ths is 12 40ths. You could also simplify this, but I tend not to simplify it just because we don't want to confuse anybody. Finally, we're going to look at this question. Which number is closest to 152, or the square root of 152? So in order to do this, we're actually going to use our calculator for this one. So this is when we're going to bust out that calculator. And the reason why we want to use the calculator is because we don't actually have what we call a perfect square of 152. There is no number that is a whole number that I can multiply by itself and get 152. And since I can't, I'm going to be looking for a decimal. And so I'm going to use my calculator and I'm going to type in square root of 152. And when I do that, I find that my answer is 12 and 32 hundredths. So I'm going to round up. And so in this case, I'm rounding to the nearest tenth. So we end up with 12 and 3/10 would be my closest answer. So that is how you can find the square root of a number. Give it a try on IXL and see how you do. Good luck.